Ava pushed open the door to the jewelry store, feeling her heart flutter as the soft chime of the bell announced her arrival. Her eyes widened, soaking in the rich glow of the showroom, where diamonds, rubies, and sapphires lay nestled in velvet and gold. It was as if she had walked straight into a magical land where everything sparkled and whispered of fairy tales. For a moment, Ava felt small in the grand, luxurious space. The polished counters reflected the glistening gems, while soft lights cast a warm glow over each display, making the jewelry shimmer like stars in the night sky. Her father had stayed outside to finish a business call, telling her to go on ahead and explore. She couldn't wait to show him everything she'd find. As she walked slowly down the first aisle, Ava kept her hands behind her back, just like she'd seen adults do, moving carefully so as not to disturb anything. She took her time at each display, allowing her mind to drift into little stories. She imagined herself at a royal ball, dancing in a gown as blue as the sapphires in the case to her left. She could see her reflection in the polished glass and smiled at the thought of wearing something so beautiful. But then, something even more breathtaking caught her eye. Just ahead, sitting openly on a small velvet-lined tray, was a diamond ring unlike anything she'd ever seen. It wasn't tucked safely behind glass like the others but lay out in the open, as if it were waiting for someone to try it on. The diamond at the center was large and dazzling, scattering tiny rainbows under the store lights. Ava glanced around, making sure she was alone. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on the ring, feeling as if it were calling to her. She stretched out her hand, hesitated, and then carefully lifted the ring from its tray. It was cool and solid in her hand, and when she slipped it onto her finger, her breath caught, fit perfectly. Ava held her hand up to the light, marveling as the diamond sparkled, throwing colorful beams onto her skin. For a moment, she felt elegant and graceful, like a princess in a world of shimmering jewels. But then, the sound of heels clicking sharply against the polished floor broke her daydream. Startled, she looked up and saw a tall, older woman standing behind the counter, her arms crossed and her face twisted into a hard, unfriendly expression. The woman's gaze dropped to the ring on Ava's finger, and her frown deepened, casting a shadow over her face. "What do you think you're doing?" the woman asked, her tone cold and sharp. Ava's heart pounded, and she fumbled to take off the ring. I was just looking," she stammered, her voice small and uncertain. She hadn't meant any harm. She was just admiring the beautiful ring. "Looking?" The woman's voice was edged with suspicion as she stepped closer. Eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe that?" Without waiting for an answer, she reached out and grabbed Ava's hand, her grip tight and unkind. Ava flinched, feeling a wave of shock and confusion rise inside her. "The ring wasn't just lying around for you to play with," the woman said in a harsh whisper. Her voice was as cold as the diamond itself, and Ava could feel her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She wanted to explain, to tell the woman that the ring had been sitting on the counter, but her words got tangled up, and all she could do was shake her head. "No, I didn't," Ava managed to whisper, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, don't lie to me," the woman snapped, her fingers digging into Ava's wrist as she held her in place. "You think you can just come in here and touch whatever you like?" Ava's stomach twisted, her excitement from earlier now a distant memory. She tried to pull her hand free, feeling smaller and smaller under the woman's harsh gaze. But the woman only released her with a small shove, snatching the ring off Ava's finger and slapping it back onto the tray with a clatter. "This isn't a place for little girls to play," the woman continued, her tone dripping with disdain. "What kind of parents let a child like you wander around unsupervised?" The sting of the woman's words sank deep, and Ava felt tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She thought of her father, just outside, and wished he would come in and take her away from this cold, unwelcoming place. "My dad, he's outside," Ava said, her voice trembling. "He told me I could look around." "Outside? Is he?" The woman's voice was thick with scorn. her eyes narrowing further. "Oh, I'm sure he'd say anything to cover for you if he had to." Ava's vision blurred as the woman's words hit her with the force of a slap. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't thought her innocent fascination would turn into something so awful. Her throat tightened, and despite her best efforts to hold them back, a tear slipped down her cheek. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss out on our next one. Ava's cheeks burned as she blinked back tears, struggling to steady her breathing. She felt the weight of the saleswoman's scorn pressing down on her, making her feel small and out of place. Ava had never felt so unwelcome in her life. The saleswoman, tall and severe, stood over her with arms crossed, the diamond ring now lying back on its tray as if it, too, were mocking her. She looked Ava up and down, her eyes filled with a cold, judgmental glare. "People like you have no place in a store like this," the woman muttered, her tone laced with disdain. Ava's stomach knotted. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had just wanted to admire the ring, to try it on, to feel like one of the elegant women she'd seen in magazines. But now, standing under the saleswoman's harsh gaze, her small fingers trembling, she felt foolish, as if she'd broken some invisible rule she didn't even know existed. "I didn't mean any harm," Ava whispered, barely able to meet the woman's eyes. She felt a lump forming in her throat, her voice tight as she tried to explain. "I just wanted to see what it looked like. It was right here, on the counter." "Oh, really?" the woman scoffed, rolling her eyes. "That's the excuse you're going with?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You must think you're clever, don't you? Coming in here, playing innocent, thinking you can just slip something into your pocket." Ava's mouth dropped open, shock flooding her. Pocket? She hadn't even thought of stealing anything. The very idea felt foreign, impossible. Yet here she was, being accused, with nothing but her word to defend herself. "No," Ava stammered, shaking her head vigorously, her voice barely a whisper. I would never." But the woman was unmoved. She tightened her crossed arms, her eyes narrowing as if Ava's very presence were an offense. "I've seen your kind before," she said, her voice thick with contempt. "Coming in here with your little act, thinking you can fool me. Well, I don't buy it. I can spot a thief from a mile away. And I'm not about to let you waltz out of here with one of my rings." Ava's heart felt like it might shatter. She wanted to scream, to tell the woman she was wrong, that she was simply here to admire the beauty of the jewelry. But she was frozen. The words lodged in her throat as the woman's scorn grew harsher, more unyielding. She tried again, her voice weak but determined. "My dad. He told me I could come in and look around. He's just outside, finishing a phone call. I wasn't trying to take anything." The woman snorted, an ugly, disbelieving sound. "Oh, I'm sure he's just waiting to jump in and cover for you. Typical." She waved her hand dismissively, as if Ava's words meant nothing. Those words stung the most. Ava could feel the woman's judgment, could feel the weight of her assumptions pressing down like stones, each one heavier than the last. She didn't know what else to say. Everything she tried to explain only seemed to make the woman angrier, as though Ava's very presence was an insult. The store's door chimed, and Ava's heart leapt. She turned and saw her father, Marcus, stepping into the store. His tall figure moved gracefully across the floor, his eyes immediately drawn to Ava. His face softened with a smile, but as he took in her tear-streaked face and the tension in her small frame, his expression hardened. He strode quickly toward her, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "Ava?" he asked gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. "What happened?" "Sweetheart." Ava clung to his hand, feeling relief flood through her at his familiar, comforting presence. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was just looking at the ring. It was right here on the counter. And she said I was trying to steal it." Marcus's face darkened, and he slowly rose, turning his attention to the saleswoman, who crossed her arms even tighter. eyes flashing with defiance. "Is that so?" Marcus asked, his voice steady and measured, his gaze fixed on the woman, his calm demeanor masking a fury that simmered beneath the surface. "So you're accusing my daughter of stealing a ring?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, and she gave a small, disapproving nod. "Yes," she replied coldly. "Your daughter was handling an expensive ring from our display. It wasn't on the counter, as she claims. She must have taken it from behind the glass." Ava shook her head desperately, looking up at her father with pleading eyes. "No, Daddy, it was right here," she insisted, pointing to the tray on the counter. "I didn't take anything. I just wanted to look at it." The woman scoffed, an ugly smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Of course she'd say that," she said, her tone dripping with smug satisfaction. "I see this all the time. People come in with their excuses. Just looking. Didn't mean any harm. Thinking they can get away with anything if they act innocent." Marcus's jaw tightened, his voice low and steely. "So you're accusing my daughter, a child, of lying and theft, based on nothing more than your assumptions." His words were calm, yet his tone cut through the air like a blade. The woman huffed, her expression hardening even further. "I don't care what you think," she snapped. "I know what I saw, and I know my job. My job is to protect this store's merchandise and reputation, and I won't let people like her." She nodded at Ava. "Come in here and act however they want." Ava's eyes widened, her heart sinking as the woman's words echoed in her mind. People like her. She felt a fresh sting of tears as she realized what the woman meant, how she saw her as something different, something less. Marcus's gaze hardened, his voice now dangerously calm. "People like her?" he repeated, his tone edged with a quiet, simmering rage. "Are you saying my daughter doesn't belong here? Because of how she looks?" The woman's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. She raised her chin defiantly. "I didn't mean it that way, but we have rules in this store. Rules that must be followed. And I have a job to do." Marcus's eyes didn't leave hers. Unyielding, cold, and unforgiving. "Rules," he said quietly, his voice laced with controlled anger. "If anyone here has broken the rules, it isn't my daughter." He stepped closer, his frame towering over the woman. "And I suggest you tread carefully with what you say next." The woman hesitated, but her pride won out. She crossed her arms, giving him a thin, triumphant smile. "Fine," she sneered. "Then I'll call security to handle this. I'm sure they'll agree that we don't allow people like her to wander around touching things they can't afford." Ava's heart sank, her eyes filling with tears as the woman's words hung in the air. Cruel and unforgiving. She clung to her father's hand, her heart pounding with a mix of shame and fear. But as she looked up at him, she saw a fierce, protective light in his eyes, and her heart lifted slightly. Marcus met the woman's gaze with a look so steady, so unflinching, that she seemed to falter for the first time. "You go right ahead," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "Call whoever you need to, but when you do, make sure you call corporate, too. I think they'll be very interested to hear about the way you've treated my daughter. And I guarantee, by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly who we are." The saleswoman's face froze, her eyes narrowing as she registered the challenge in Marcus's words. But, rather than backing down, she scoffed, folding her arms tighter across her chest. "Oh, really?" she sneered, her voice laced with condescension. "You think you can scare me with empty threats? I know exactly how to deal with situations like this. Security will be here any second. And then maybe you'll think twice before pulling stunts like this in the future." Ava gripped her father's hand, looking up at him with a mix of worry and hope. She could feel the tension radiating from him, his grip on her hand both gentle and strong. A silent promise that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. She didn't fully understand the saleswoman's words, but she knew from her tone that she didn't think highly of her or her dad. But Marcus's calm never wavered. His gaze remained steady, unflinching as he looked down at the woman who had reduced his daughter's wonder to shame in mere moments. He took a measured breath, his voice low and controlled as he spoke. "I don't believe you understand who you're dealing with," he said, his tone unyielding. "Because if you did, you'd know that your actions have consequences. Consequences that go beyond a single call to security." His words seemed to ripple through the air, firm and unbreakable, filling the room with a tension that was as heavy as it was silent. Just then, the soft chime of the store's door sounded, and a man in a dark security uniform stepped in, his gaze scanning the room before landing on the saleswoman, who wasted no time in motioning him over. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, her voice dripping with exaggerated relief. "Please escort these two out of the store. They've caused a disturbance. And the girl was handling one of our rings without permission. I've asked them to leave, but they've refused." She shot Marcus a smug look, as if she had already won. The security guard approached Marcus, his expression neutral but firm. "Sir," he began, keeping his voice even, "this is a private establishment, and if the staff feel there's been a disturbance, we're obligated to address it by asking the involved parties to leave." Marcus met the guard's gaze, his face calm yet impenetrable. He held his daughter close, his hand a steadying anchor for her small fingers. "I understand you're doing your job," he replied, his voice still controlled, though a spark of frustration flickered in his eyes. "But I suggest you take a moment to consider that there's more going on here than what's been presented to you." The guard hesitated, glancing briefly at the saleswoman, who was practically vibrating with satisfaction. She folded her arms and gave Marcus a mocking smile. "You heard him," she said, barely disguising her glee. "We have rules here, and if you can't follow them, you're free to take your business elsewhere." Marcus's jaw tightened, and he turned back to the guard, speaking clearly, his voice unwavering. "I respect store policies, and I respect your protocol. But let me make something very clear. I also respect my daughter, and I will not tolerate anyone treating her as less than she deserves. So, before you proceed, I suggest you confirm a few things with corporate." The saleswoman rolled her eyes, scoffing as if Marcus's words were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Corporate," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, please, I know a bluff when I hear one. If you're really who you claim to be, then prove it." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression cool and unchanging. "Very well," he said, pulling out his phone. His fingers moved swiftly over the screen as he typed a quick message, the air around him thick with an unspoken authority that neither the guard nor the saleswoman seemed prepared for. The woman's smug expression faltered for the briefest of moments, but she quickly masked it, planting her hands on her hips. "You have 5 minutes," she declared, glancing at her watch. 5 minutes before security escorts you out." Marcus didn't bother responding. He simply finished his message, hit send, and looked down at Ava, giving her a reassuring smile. "Everything's going to be all right, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice calm and warm, as though they were the only two people in the room. The seconds ticked by, and for a moment, it seemed as though nothing would change. The saleswoman checked her watch, her confidence growing with each passing second. But then, just as she opened her mouth to deliver a final smug remark, Marcus's phone pinged with a reply. He glanced at the screen, his expression calm, and then looked back at the saleswoman, a hint of something unshakable in his gaze. "It seems your time is up," he said, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. "Now, let's see if you're willing to take this all the way to corporate." The woman's face paled slightly, though she kept her stance, crossing her arms with a defiant huff. "Fine," she said, her voice faltering just a bit. "Call whoever you want. It won't change anything. You're still going to have to leave." But before Marcus could respond, the store's main phone rang, piercing the tense silence. The saleswoman looked at it, her expression faltering for a fraction of a second. then forced herself to walk over and answer it. "Good afternoon," she greeted, her voice a shade less confident than before. "This is, oh." Her face went ashen as she listened to the voice on the other end, her eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the security guard. She stammered, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Yes, I understand." After a brief pause, she hung up the phone, her face drained of color, her earlier smugness nowhere to be seen. She turned slowly to Marcus, struggling to find her voice. "Mr. Green, I didn't realize. Marcus's face was impassive, his gaze unwavering as he looked at her. "That's right," he said calmly. "You didn't realize. You didn't think twice before accusing my daughter of theft. You didn't bother to consider who she was or, more importantly, who she might grow up to be. You saw what you wanted to see, and now you're facing the consequences." The saleswoman opened her mouth to respond, but words failed her. She looked down, her hands wringing nervously as she stammered. I was just doing my job, Mr. Green. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" Marcus interrupted, his tone cutting. "Didn't mean to humiliate a child? Didn't mean to assume she was guilty because of your own prejudices?" A heavy silence settled over the room. The security guard, sensing the gravity of the situation, took a step back, giving Marcus and the saleswoman space. Eva, still clutching her father's hand, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, her earlier shame melting away in the warmth of his protective presence. The saleswoman shifted uncomfortably, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean any harm, sir." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Intent doesn't erase impact," he replied, his voice steady but firm. "And in this case, the impact was clear. You made my daughter feel as though she didn't belong. You judged her not on her actions, but on your assumptions. And that," he paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is something I won't tolerate in my company." The woman's face went completely pale as his words hit home. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, her earlier arrogance crumbling as the reality of her situation became clear. Turning to the security guard, Marcus gave a respectful nod. "Thank you for your time," he said, his tone calm but dismissive. "There's no need for further action on your part." The guard nodded, glancing briefly at the saleswoman before stepping back. Understanding that his involvement was no longer needed, he left the room quietly, leaving the three of them alone. Marcus looked down at Eva, giving her a soft, reassuring smile. "Come on, sweetheart," he said gently. "We're done here, together." They walked toward the door, leaving the saleswoman standing alone, her face ashen and her hands trembling. Just before they stepped outside, Marcus paused, turning back to look at her one last time. "Next time you think about making assumptions," he said, his voice cold and clear, "remember that every customer deserves respect, no matter who they are or who you think they're not." Without waiting for a response, he led Eva out of the store, his hand firm and steady as they stepped into the sunlight. Eva looked up at him, her eyes bright with gratitude, a newfound confidence blossoming in her chest. For the first time since she'd entered the store, she felt safe, knowing that her father had stood up for her with unwavering strength. And as they walked away, Eva knew that, because of him, she'd never let anyone make her feel small again.
Quarto. Bạn đã nói. Bằng tiếng Anh viết chương 4 một cách hấp dẫn người đọc chi tiết. Jack đã nói.
ChatGPT. Chapter 4. The Revelation. As they left the store, Marcus held Ava's hand tightly, his face a mask of calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. They walked in silence to his car, where he opened the door for Ava, helping her climb in before settling into the driver's seat beside her. She looked up at him with a mixture of relief and lingering confusion, wondering what would happen next. After a moment of silence, Marcus turned to Ava, his expression softening as he took in her tear-streaked face. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gentle but steady. Ava nodded, though her eyes were still wide with the shock of what had just happened. I didn't do anything wrong, Daddy, she whispered, a hint of hurt in her voice. I was just looking at the ring. It was so pretty, I just wanted to see it. Marcus reached over, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. I know you didn't do anything wrong, Ava, he said firmly. You have every right to look at anything you want. And no one, has the right to make you feel less than anyone else. Ava managed a small smile, comforted by her father's words, but a flicker of uncertainty remained in her eyes. But, Daddy, why did she say those things to me? Why did she think I was stealing? Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, people make judgments about others without knowing anything about them. He said slowly. They look at someone and think they know who they are based on appearances alone. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it happens. And today, that woman chose to see you in a way that says far more about her than it does about you. Ava nodded, listening intently as she tried to process his words. She hadn't expected her visit to the jewelry store to end in such a strange, hurtful experience. But as she looked at her father, she felt a newfound sense of understanding, as if he were letting her in on a truth she hadn't yet known about the world. Marcus's gaze turned thoughtful, and a determined glint flickered in his eyes. He glanced down at his phone, as if making a decision. There's one more thing I need to do, he said, glancing back at Ava with a reassuring smile. I want you to come with me, if you're up for it. I think it's important for you to see that when people do wrong, there are consequences, and I want her to see exactly who she tried to humiliate today. Ava looked at him, wide-eyed but curious, and nodded. She didn't know exactly what her father planned to do, but she trusted him completely. Marcus gave her hand a gentle squeeze, then tapped a few buttons on his phone. I'm going to make a call, he explained, and we're going to pay a visit to some of the people in charge of that store. They need to know what happened today. He dialed a number and waited, his face calm but unyielding. After a moment, he spoke into the phone, his tone firm and resolute. Hello, this is Marcus Green. Yes, I'm calling regarding an incident that took place at one of our jewelry store locations. I'll need the general manager and executive team to meet us at headquarters immediately. He paused, listening to the response on the other end. Yes, it's urgent. I'll be there shortly. He hung up and turned back to Ava, giving her a reassuring smile. Let's go, he said. It's time to set things right. The drive to the company headquarters was brief but filled with a sense of purpose. Ava could feel her father's determination radiating from him, and it filled her with a quiet courage. She sat up a little straighter in her seat, feeling as though she were about to be part of something important. When they arrived, Marcus led Ava into a grand building with gleaming glass walls and polished floors. She had been here before, during company events, but this time felt different. This time, she was here for a reason, and that reason was her. As they made their way to a large conference room, Ava noticed a few familiar faces, executives she'd seen from company gatherings, waiting inside. Their expressions were serious, a hint of curiosity mingling with concern as they greeted Marcus with respectful nods. The general manager, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward, extending a hand to Marcus. Mr. Green, it's a pleasure to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances, he said, glancing down at Ava with a soft smile. And hello to you, Ava. It's wonderful to see you. Ava smiled shyly, gripping her father's hand as they took seats at the table. Marcus remained standing, his calm demeanor unbroken as he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each executive in turn. Thank you all for coming on short notice, he began, his voice steady but laced with an underlying edge. I called this meeting because something happened today, something unacceptable. And it's not something I'm willing to overlook. The executives shifted slightly, exchanging glances, and the general manager leaned forward, his expression attentive. Please, go on, Mr. Green. Marcus took a slow breath, then explained everything that had happened at the jewelry store. He described how Ava had been drawn to a diamond ring left out on display, how she had admired it innocently, only to be accused of theft by the saleswoman. As he spoke, Ava felt a strange sense of validation, as if each word from her father helped to untangle the hurt she'd felt, replacing it with something stronger, something that felt like justice. The room grew tense as Marcus finished recounting the story. The executives listened in stunned silence, their faces a mix of disbelief and outrage. The general manager's brow furrowed, and he shook his head, glancing down as if ashamed. This is absolutely appalling, the general manager finally said, his voice quiet but filled with anger. Mr. Green, I can't tell you how sorry I am that this happened. I assure you, we take incidents like this extremely seriously. No employee of ours should ever behave that way, especially not toward one of our own family members. Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. I appreciate that, but this isn't just about family. No child, no customer, should ever be made to feel the way my daughter felt today. The issue here isn't just about one employee's behavior. It's about ensuring that no one else, especially our young customers, experiences something like this again. One of the other executives, a woman with a kind face and bright, empathetic eyes, leaned forward, her voice gentle but resolute. Mr. Green, I want you to know that we will address this immediately. The saleswoman will be dismissed, and we'll make sure her actions are documented as misconduct due to discriminatory behavior. She won't be able to represent our company or treat another child this way ever again. Ava's heart swelled as she listened, watching her father stand up for her with such strength and purpose. She glanced around the room, noticing how everyone seemed genuinely moved, their commitment to making things right clear in their faces. Marcus nodded at the woman, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, he said quietly, and I would also ask that we go further. We need to review our employee training, particularly around customer service and cultural sensitivity. This should never have happened, and we need to be sure it never will again. The executives exchanged nods, each of them visibly moved by his words. The general manager turned to Marcus with a look of respect. Consider it done. We'll implement new training protocols immediately, and I assure you, this will be taken very seriously across all our stores. As the meeting concluded, Marcus turned to Ava, giving her a reassuring smile. You did well, sweetheart, he said, his voice filled with pride. I hope you know how much you're worth, and that no one can take that away from you. Ava beamed up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. For the first time since the incident, she felt truly seen, her worth validated by the way her father had fought for her, and by the way everyone in that room had listened and promised change. As they left the headquarters, Ava felt a newfound confidence settling within her. She realized that she had witnessed something important today, not just a lesson about fairness and respect, but a powerful reminder of her own worth. And she knew, deep down, that she would carry this moment with her always, a bright, unwavering light against any shadows of doubt or prejudice she might face in the future. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Ava sat across from her father, finishing her breakfast. She still felt a lingering sadness from what had happened in the jewelry store, but her father's calm strength had eased some of the hurt. As she watched him on his phone, his voice calm but firm, she felt a new spark of curiosity. Today, she was eager to learn what would happen next. After ending his call, Marcus turned to her with a reassuring smile. Are you ready to come with me today? He asked. Where are we going? Ava asked, setting her spoon down, her curiosity growing. We're going back to the jewelry store, he explained, his gaze steady. But this time, You'll see that actions have consequences. What happened yesterday is something that shouldn't go unanswered. And I want you to see how we stand up for ourselves and hold others accountable. Ava nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She trusted her father completely, and though she wasn't sure what to expect, she knew he would guide her. As they entered the jewelry store that morning, the atmosphere was tense and hushed. The few employees on the floor whispered among themselves, glancing in Marcus and Ava's direction before quickly looking away. Ava clutched her father's hand as they walked through the store, the memory of the woman's harsh words still fresh in her mind. At the far end of the room, near a polished glass display case, the store's general manager was waiting. He was a tall man with a composed expression, though his eyes were filled with worry as he approached Marcus. Behind him, standing stiffly, was the saleswoman, her earlier confidence now replaced by a look of unease. She shifted nervously, her arms crossed over her chest, and her face paled slightly when she met Marcus's unyielding gaze. "Mr. Green, thank you for coming in," the general manager greeted, his tone respectful. "We're here to address the incident from yesterday." He glanced down at Ava with a kind smile, though his eyes held a hint of sorrow, as if he felt the weight of what she'd been put through. Marcus nodded, his hand resting protectively on Ava's shoulder. "Thank you for meeting us," he replied, his voice calm but edged with authority. "I wanted my daughter to be here, to see that when someone wrongs us, we have the right to speak up and seek accountability." The general manager gave a solemn nod, then turned to the saleswoman. She looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting from Ava to Marcus, her mouth tightening as she struggled to keep her composure. The general manager cleared his throat. "I believe it's important for you to hear from Mr. Green directly, and from Ava as well, if she wishes. This isn't just a disciplinary action. It's about ensuring everyone here understands our values and upholds them." The saleswoman shifted uncomfortably, finally mumbling, "I understand." She looked down, her earlier arrogance melting under the weight of the room's silence. Marcus looked at her steadily, his voice measured. "I want you to understand exactly why we're here today," he said. "Yesterday, you judged my daughter based solely on your assumptions. You accused her of theft without proof, treated her with disrespect, and made her feel unwelcome in her own father's store." The saleswoman glanced away, her cheeks flushing. She fumbled for words, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean, I didn't know who she was." "That's exactly the point," Marcus replied, his voice cold and clear. "It shouldn't have mattered who she was. Every customer deserves respect, and certainly every child deserves to be treated with kindness. But you didn't give her either. You judged her because you saw someone you assumed didn't belong." Ava felt her father's hand rest on her shoulder, a gentle but powerful reminder that she wasn't alone. She looked up at him, finding strength in his presence. She wanted to add something, to make her own voice heard. With a small breath, she looked at the saleswoman and spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I didn't want to take anything," she said softly. "I just thought the ring was pretty. I just wanted to look at it." The saleswoman's face reddened, her eyes darting around as she struggled to respond. I'm sorry, Eva," she muttered, her tone devoid of the previous day's sharpness. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I appreciate the apology, but words alone don't undo the harm you caused. Yesterday, you took something from my daughter, her sense of belonging, her excitement. That's not something that can be brushed off with a simple apology." He turned to the general manager. "I expect that this incident will lead to not only corrective action but also changes in training. No child, no person, should ever be treated this way again." The general manager nodded firmly. "You have my word, Mr. Green." We will take immediate steps to ensure our staff receive comprehensive training in customer service and cultural sensitivity. We value respect and integrity above all. And I'm ashamed that this happened within our store. The saleswoman stood in silence, her gaze lowered, knowing that her actions had consequences far beyond what she'd anticipated. She looked over at Ava, her face filled with regret, but Ava only held her father's hand tighter, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice softer now as he addressed the general manager. "I appreciate your commitment to making things right." As they turned to leave, Marcus paused, giving the saleswoman one last look. "I hope you remember this moment. It's easy to judge, easy to assume, but it's much harder to listen, to respect, and to understand. Remember that." With that, he took Ava's hand, guiding her gently toward the door. As they walked out of the store together, Ava felt an unspoken weight lift from her shoulders. Her father had stood up for her, had shown her that her dignity mattered, that no one could take her worth away from her, and she had found her own voice, too. A small but powerful reminder that she was strong, valued, and seen. As they stepped into the fresh morning air, Ava looked up at her father, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, Daddy," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. He knelt down to her level, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face and smiling. "You're welcome, sweetheart," he replied. "Remember, no one has the right to make you feel less than you are, and if they try, you have every right to stand up for yourself." Ava nodded, her heart lighter than it had been since the previous day. She knew that, with her father's guidance and her own strength, she could face anything that came her way. The next day, Marcus sat at his office desk, the sunlight casting a warm glow across his polished workspace. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on his mind. He had taken immediate action to address the incident, but the thought of his daughter's mistreatment still gnawed at him. He knew that simply dismissing the saleswoman wasn't enough. She shouldn't be able to walk into another high-end store and treat any customer, child or adult, with the same prejudice. Marcus reached for his phone, dialing the number of an old friend, James, who owned a luxury line of boutiques across the city. After a few rings, James answered, his voice warm and welcoming. "Marcus, good to hear from you. What's the occasion?" Marcus's tone was calm but serious. "James, I wanted to talk to you about something that happened recently. It's a situation I think you'd want to be aware of." As Marcus recounted the story, he heard the shock and indignation growing in James's voice. By the time he finished, there was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. "That's unbelievable," James finally said, his voice laced with disgust. "To treat anyone that way, let alone a child? And in a store like yours, where customer experience should be everything. I'm so sorry that happened to Ava." "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I've dismissed the saleswoman, of course, but I think this needs to go further. Prejudice like that doesn't belong in any of our stores. People should feel valued, no matter their age, background, or appearance." "I couldn't agree more," James said, his tone hardening with resolve. "People like that have no place in this industry. You have my word. I'll make sure she doesn't end up working at any of our boutiques." Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction but knew there were more calls to make. He spent the rest of the morning reaching out to other contacts across the luxury retail world, executives at high-end hotels, exclusive department stores, and other boutique owners. He explained what had happened, detailing the incident in a way that conveyed both the unprofessionalism and the harmful bias behind the saleswoman's actions. Each call brought a similar response: outrage, disbelief, and a firm commitment to preventing someone like her from being hired in their establishments. By the time he made his last call, Marcus had set in motion a powerful network of influence, ensuring that her behavior wouldn't go unnoticed. Satisfied, he leaned back in his chair, gazing out of his office window, He knew that the saleswoman would now find it difficult to secure another position in the luxury retail sector. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting the standards that he and his peers had worked so hard to build. The message was clear. Customer dignity and respect were paramount, and there would be no tolerance for anyone who didn't uphold those values. That evening, as Marcus sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ava came outside and curled up beside him. She looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "Daddy," she began softly, "did you make sure that lady won't be mean to other people?" Marcus wrapped an arm around her, smiling down at her with pride. "I did, sweetheart. People like her will find that their actions have consequences. And because of you, because you were brave and stood up, I was able to make sure she won't hurt anyone else." Ava nodded, a small smile spreading across her face. She nestled closer to her father, feeling a sense of comfort and strength. She knew that no one had the right to make her feel small again, and that her father would always be there to protect her. As they sat together in the fading light, Marcus felt a deep peace settle within him. The events of the past few days had brought challenges and painful truths, but they had also strengthened their bond and reminded him of the values he wanted Ava to carry with her: courage, resilience, and the unshakable belief that she deserved respect and dignity. In his heart, Marcus knew that his actions had made a difference, not only for Ava but for every future customer who walked into one of his stores. And as he held his daughter close, he knew that she would carry this lesson with her for the rest of her life. Quarto.
Bạn đã nói. Bằng tiếng Anh viết chương 7 một cách hấp dẫn người đọc chi tiết. Jack đã nói.
ChatGPT. Chapter 7. The Employee's Plea. Several weeks passed since the incident, and the initial anger and frustration had begun to fade, leaving Marcus with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had taken every measure to ensure that his daughter's experience wouldn't be repeated, not in his store, nor in any other luxury establishment within his reach. His days had returned to their usual rhythm, filled with meetings, planning, and new initiatives. One morning, while he was deep in a review of quarterly reports, his assistant knocked lightly on his office door, her face a mixture of surprise and unease. "Mr. Green, there's someone here to see you," she said, her tone cautious. It's the former saleswoman from the jewelry store. She says it's urgent." Marcus's expression hardened. He knew immediately why she was here. He had ensured her termination and made certain that her behavior followed her wherever she applied. She must have found it nearly impossible to secure another job in the industry. After a long moment, he nodded. "Send her in," he replied, his voice calm but unyielding. Moments later, the woman entered, looking nothing like the arrogant, self-assured employee he remembered from the day in the store. Her shoulders were hunched, and her eyes looked red-rimmed and weary, as if sleep had been eluding her. She clutched her purse tightly, her gaze flickering nervously to the floor before she looked up, struggling to meet his eyes. "Mr. Green," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I'm the last person you probably wanted to see." Marcus studied her, his expression unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, waiting for her to continue, offering no reassurance or encouragement. She took a shaky breath, her voice trembling. "Ever since that day, since what happened with your daughter, I've been trying to find work. But no one will hire me," she admitted, her voice cracking as she spoke. "I've applied everywhere, every boutique, every luxury store, and they've all turned me away. I'm here because I don't know where else to turn." Marcus's gaze didn't waver, and he remained silent, letting her words settle into the room. The woman wrung her hands together, her face a mask of regret and desperation. "Mr. Green, I know I was wrong. I judged your daughter unfairly, and I made a terrible mistake. I can't tell you how sorry I am. I've been attending seminars, reading about diversity, trying to change. But none of it seems to matter. No one will give me a second chance." She swallowed hard, her voice breaking slightly. I have a family, Mr. Green. I'm months behind on my rent. I'm here today to ask for your help, for any chance you might give me to make this right. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of anger sparking in his gaze. He took a deep breath, holding back the words that rose to the surface as he listened. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and cold. You expect me to forgive what happened because you're facing consequences now? He asked, his tone sharp. Do you think that a few seminars and some apologies are enough to erase the harm you caused? The woman flinched, a tear slipping down her cheek. She took a step forward, her voice pleading. Please, Mr. Green, I know what I did was wrong, but I've changed. I swear I have. I've been trying to be a better person, to learn from my mistakes. I'm not the same person I was that day. Marcus shook his head slowly, his expression unmoved. No, you only care now because you've lost everything. You care because you're desperate, not because you're truly sorry for what you did to my daughter. If that weren't the case, you would have seen her as the innocent child she was from the start. The woman's shoulders slumped, her face a picture of despair. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. I understand. I don't deserve forgiveness. But please, I'm begging you, don't let this mistake define me forever. I'm willing to do anything to make this right. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. What about my daughter? He demanded, his voice rising slightly. What about the lesson she learned because of you? That people like you exist, people who will judge her, make her feel like she doesn't belong, simply because of their own prejudices. You taught her a harsh truth that day, one she didn't deserve to learn at such a young age. The woman's hands shook as she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I know, she whispered. And I'm sorry, so sorry. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Sorry isn't enough. The truth is, you only realized the impact of your actions when it was too late, when you found yourself on the other side of the door. But that doesn't mean you truly understand the harm you caused. It doesn't mean you're someone I would ever trust in my store, or in any store I respect. The woman nodded slowly, her face stricken with regret and helplessness. She took a shaky breath, looking up at him with one last glimmer of hope. Please, Mr. Green, please. I have nowhere else to go. Marcus's gaze softened for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. People only truly change when they take responsibility for their actions from the start, not when they're forced to. I can't and won't undo the path you created for yourself. You'll have to find a way to make things right on your own. The woman's face crumpled, and she nodded, realizing the finality in his words. She turned slowly, her shoulders slumped as she walked toward the door. Just before she exited, she paused, glancing back at Marcus, her eyes filled with regret. I understand, she whispered. Thank you for hearing me out. Marcus didn't respond, watching silently as she left the room, defeated and alone. He remained still for a moment after she was gone, reflecting on their conversation. Part of him felt the weight of her despair, but he knew that this was a lesson she had to learn on her own. Later that evening, as Marcus sat on the back porch with Ava, he held her close, listening to the soft chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the city. She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful, and asked, Daddy, did that lady ever say sorry? Marcus took a deep breath, considering how to explain it. Yes, sweetheart, she did. She came to see me today. Ava looked up at him with wide eyes, surprised. Did she ask you for help? Marcus nodded, his gaze distant. She did. She wanted a second chance. She said she'd changed. Ava thought about this for a moment, her young face reflecting a quiet wisdom that took Marcus by surprise. And, did you help her? No, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. Because I realized that she only wanted help because she was struggling. She only wanted to change after she lost everything. But true change, real change, comes from understanding the harm you've caused and wanting to make things better. Not just because it makes life easier for you. Ava nodded slowly, processing his words. So, it's not just about saying you're sorry. It's about meaning it, right? Marcus smiled, pride filling his heart as he looked at his daughter. Exactly, Ava. It's about truly understanding what you've done and wanting to make it right. Even if it doesn't benefit you, when we hurt others, we can't undo that hurt just because it's convenient. We have to take responsibility for our actions. Ava leaned against him, her small hand slipping into his, her face thoughtful and serene. Thank you, Daddy, for teaching me to be strong and kind. Marcus wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. In that quiet moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that his daughter understood the importance of integrity, compassion, and true accountability, and as they sat together, he knew that she would carry these lessons with her, holding her head high, unafraid of the judgments of others, and confident in her worth. As autumn leaves began to fall, casting a golden hue over the city, life had returned to a comfortable rhythm for Marcus and Ava. Yet, the events at the jewelry store lingered in both of their minds, each carrying the memory in their own way. For Marcus, it was a reminder of the battles he'd fought to protect his daughter's dignity. For Ava, it was an experience that had reshaped her understanding of how the world sometimes worked, and how to stand tall against unfairness. One crisp evening, as Marcus sat by the fireplace in their cozy living room, Ava curled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. They sat in a warm silence for a while, watching the flames dance and crackle, until Ava lifted her head to look at her father with a thoughtful expression. "Daddy," she began, her voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about that lady in the store." Marcus looked down at her, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "Oh, what have you been thinking, sweetheart?" Ava hesitated, gathering her words carefully. I think I understand now why she acted that way. She didn't see me for who I was. She only saw what she wanted to see." Ava paused, then added thoughtfully, "But does that mean people can't change? Even if they want to?" Marcus's smile softened, filled with pride at her perceptiveness. He thought about his response, choosing his words carefully. "People can change, Ava," he said gently, "but real change has to come from inside. It has to come from understanding the harm they've caused and wanting to make things right. Not just because they want something, but because they genuinely care about becoming better." Ava considered this, her face thoughtful. "Like that lady," she said slowly. "She only wanted to change after she lost everything. But if she'd really wanted to change, she would have seen me differently from the start, right?" Marcus nodded, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "That's exactly right. She didn't see you for who you truly are. She looked at you and judged you based on her own narrow view of the world. And she only wanted forgiveness because she faced consequences, not because she truly understood the hurt she'd caused." Ava leaned her head against his shoulder again, comforted by his warmth and wisdom. "I don't think I'll ever forget how she made me feel, Daddy," she whispered. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's something I need to remember, so I can be stronger." Marcus's heart swelled with pride. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the fire crackled warmly beside them. "That's very wise, Ava. We can learn from these experiences, even the painful ones. They remind us to treat others with kindness, to see people for who they truly are, not just for what we think we know about them." Ava nodded, absorbing his words. "And I want to be strong like you," she said softly. "I want to be able to stand up for myself and for others. You taught me that, Daddy." Marcus hugged her tighter, feeling a deep sense of peace as he looked down at his daughter. "You already are strong, Ava," he said, his voice filled with pride. "And you're kind, too. Strength doesn't mean fighting with anger. It means knowing when to stand firm in what you believe is right and treating others with respect, even when they don't deserve it." They sat together, watching the flames flicker as the room filled with a comfortable silence. Ava closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips as she felt the warmth of her father's embrace and the strength of his words settled deep within her. In that quiet moment, Marcus knew that she was learning one of life's most valuable lessons, not just about standing up for herself, but about carrying a sense of strength and kindness that no one could take from her. And as he held her close, he knew that no matter what she faced in the future, she would be ready. Ava would grow up with the confidence that came from understanding her own worth, and with the courage to stand up against prejudice and unfairness. And he knew that, because of this experience, she would carry forward a legacy of resilience, compassion, and quiet strength, one that would serve her well in all the years to come. Quarto.
Bạn đã nói. Bằng tiếng Anh viết chương 9 một cách hấp dẫn người đọc chi tiết. Jack đã nói.
ChatGPT. Chapter 9. A Lasting Legacy. As the days turned colder and winter began to settle in, life for Marcus and Ava resumed its familiar patterns, but with a new undercurrent of strength and understanding between them. Ava carried herself a little differently now, her gaze steady, her posture confident, and her words thoughtful. She was no longer the same little girl who had felt small and frightened in that jewelry store. Instead, she had become more sure of herself, with a quiet, newfound dignity that Marcus couldn't help but admire. One snowy afternoon, as they decorated the house for the holidays, Ava hung a string of lights along the banister, pausing occasionally to admire her work. She glanced at her father, who was untangling a garland nearby, and felt a swell of gratitude. Marcus had always been her protector, but the events of the past months had shown her that he was also her guide, teaching her how to navigate a world that wasn't always fair. "Daddy," she began, wrapping the lights around her hand as she turned to him. Do you think that what happened will help other people too? Not just me." Marcus paused, looking up at her with a thoughtful expression. "I do, sweetheart," he replied, his tone filled with conviction. Standing up for what's right isn't just about making things right for ourselves. It's about setting an example for others, so that the people around us understand what's acceptable and what isn't. And because of you, the store has changed. Ava's eyes brightened as she thought of the new training her father's store had implemented after the incident. Every employee, from managers to clerks, now received thorough training on treating each customer with respect and sensitivity, regardless of their background or appearance. Her father had even reached out to others in the industry, encouraging similar changes. She felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that her experience had sparked something bigger, something that would make the world a little bit fairer. Does that mean I helped change things?" she asked, a hint of wonder in her voice. Marcus smiled, nodding. "Absolutely. Your courage to stand up and speak out made a difference. And because of you, countless people who come into our stores will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. You helped remind everyone that each person is valuable, that no one should be judged by assumptions." Ava took this in, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She realized that her actions had an impact beyond just herself. Her story had become a part of something larger, something meaningful. She wasn't just a little girl who'd been wronged. She was a young person who had stood up for herself, who had inspired change. She smiled to herself, feeling a quiet pride that went far deeper than any award or trophy. As they continued decorating, Marcus shared more about the conversations he'd had with other leaders in the luxury retail industry. They'd been receptive, some even appalled to hear that such prejudice could happen in one of their own stores. Many of them had implemented similar policies, ensuring that each customer who walked through their doors would be treated with care and respect. Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the ripples of their actions had spread far and wide. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Ava nestled close to her father, feeling the warmth of the flames and the glow of the holiday lights reflected in the window. She looked up at him, her eyes full of admiration and gratitude. "Thank you, Daddy," she said softly, "for helping me understand and for teaching me to be strong." Marcus hugged her close, his heart swelling with love and pride. You're welcome, Ava. But remember, the strength was always in you. I just helped you see it. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought, watching the fire flicker and dance. Ava thought of everything she'd learned, not just about standing up for herself, but about seeing others with kindness, about how actions had consequences, and about the importance of fairness. She felt as if she'd grown stronger, not only in how she saw herself but in how she would treat others as well. As the snow began to fall gently outside, blanketing the world in a quiet peace, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He knew that Ava would carry this experience with her throughout her life, and that it would shape her into a compassionate, resilient young woman who would never hesitate to stand up for what she believed in. And as they sat together, father and daughter, surrounded by the warmth of their home, he knew that the legacy they had built, a legacy of respect, integrity, and courage, was one that would live on, lighting Ava's path and the paths of those around her. For many years to come, as winter melted into spring, life moved forward with a steady, comforting rhythm. Ava was growing older and wiser with each day, her confidence blooming like the new buds on the trees outside her window. Marcus watched with pride as his daughter embraced life's challenges with resilience and grace, carrying the hard-won lessons of the past months in her heart. One weekend, Ava was invited to her friend Sophia's birthday party, held at an upscale restaurant in the city. She chose a simple but elegant dress, and as she looked in the mirror, she felt a quiet pride. Gone was the uncertainty that had once lingered in her eyes, replaced by a spark of self-assurance. With her father's words echoing in her mind, she was ready to face the world with strength and kindness. At the restaurant, the children laughed and talked, enjoying the bright decorations and delicious food. As they moved to a dessert table filled with cakes and treats, Ava noticed one of the servers, a tall man in a pressed uniform, watching her with a peculiar expression. She could see a hint of judgment in his gaze, and a small, familiar feeling of unease tried to creep into her chest. But then she remembered everything her father had taught her, the importance of standing tall, of remembering her worth, and of meeting the world's judgments with quiet confidence. She smiled to herself, her spine straightening as she looked back at the server, her gaze steady. She didn't need anyone else's approval to know who she was. Just then, Sophia ran over, pulling Ava into a hug, and the two of them began laughing again, moving on to another part of the restaurant, leaving the server's gaze behind. Ava felt a wave of freedom wash over her. She realized that no one's opinion could touch her sense of self-worth, and that the strength her father had helped her build was now hers to carry. Later that evening, when Marcus picked her up, he could see the lightness in her step as she approached the car. She climbed in, her eyes shining, and looked over at him with a grin. "Did you have fun?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. "I did," Ava replied, settling back into her seat. "And, Daddy, I think I finally understand everything you taught me today." Someone looked at me differently, but I didn't let it bother me. I know who I am. I know I belong. Marcus's heart swelled with pride, and he reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "That's my girl," he said softly. "You'll face all kinds of people in life, Ava. Some will see you for who you truly are, and others will judge without knowing anything about you. But as long as you know your own worth, no one can ever take that away." Ava nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know, Daddy, and I think I want to help others feel the same way someday. I want to show people that they're valuable, too." Marcus smiled, a glimmer of tears in his eyes as he realized just how much his little girl had grown. "You already do, Ava, just by being yourself. You make the world a better place." The drive home was filled with quiet conversation, the two of them sharing thoughts and dreams for the future. Marcus felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that Ava was not only strong but also filled with kindness and compassion, qualities that would guide her through life. That night, after Ava went to bed, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything they had experienced together. He realized that the struggles, the lessons, and the victories weren't just for Ava, they had changed him too. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what was right, not just for his family but for everyone who might walk through the doors of his stores. From that day forward, Marcus carried on his work with even greater dedication, implementing policies and leading conversations within his industry to ensure that every customer, regardless of who they were, was treated with respect and dignity. He knew that small actions had the power to create ripples, changing lives and shaping a future where fairness and kindness were not ideals, but everyday realities. As the years passed, Ava grew into a remarkable young woman, confident in herself and unafraid to stand up for others. She remembered the lessons her father had taught her, carrying them like treasures, and she made it her mission to spread that sense of belonging and respect to everyone she encountered. And in their home, as the seasons changed and time moved forward, father and daughter continued to share their bond, a legacy of strength, love, and resilience. They knew that they were not only shaping each other's lives but also, in some small way, making the world a better place for those who would come after them.